Hi guys, welcome back to Gardening with Creations by DX & Co. Today we're going to start episode 2 of our garden planning series, specifically around choosing which way to start your crops. So there are 3 different methods that a lot of people choose. I'm sure there's lots of methods out there, but there's 3 different methods that a lot of people choose to start their crops. Either starting your seeds indoors in pots and seed starters, so on and so forth, or starting them outside, direct sowing, otherwise known as direct sowing, or 3, buying starter plants, already pre-grown plants started, and then transplanting them directly into your garden when the season's right. So we're going to go through some pros and cons of each of those steps today, and we'll see which method that you feel is best for you. So stay tuned, let's get started. For those of you who were able to watch episode 1 of the garden planning series, choosing which bed type is right for you, then you'll be very familiar with this format. I'm just going to go through the pros and cons of each of these, starting specifically with the indoor seed starting. Okay, so let's get into the pros of that today. So one of the great benefits of doing indoor seed starting or direct sowing, but specifically is choosing the seed variety. So there are tons of different varieties depending on which crop you're looking to grow. Tomatoes have many different types of varieties of tomatoes, and so do potatoes, so do greens, anything under the sun. Just about globally, there's a different variety of those type of things. So the benefit of actually starting your own seeds is indoors is being able to go out and either order those seeds online or go to this local store and pick up those seed varieties. So variety is a huge benefit to starting seeds indoors, and you can really even buy soil types to match that. So that's a huge benefit to growing seeds indoors. Also, you're able to get a jump start on your season, if you will. And what I mean by that is if you wait till Zone 6A here, Michigan, if I wait till I'm able to direct sow a tomato and or a pepper plant, I'm not going to be able to get those. I'm not going to get those to mature to get fruit or tomatoes or peppers onto my plants because I have such a short growing season. So I won't be able to get that jump start like I want to if I don't start indoors. So starting indoors is a huge way to get a jump start. I usually recommend, if you saw in my video before this one, I'll link it in the description below as well as at the end of this video, about when to start. And when to start is recommended usually about 5 to 6 weeks before the last frost date. You can check out the Farmer's Almanac for your frost date in your zone. All right, so another reason that people start seeds inside as opposed to transplants or other methods is that it is less expensive to actually start from seed. So whether that be your saving seeds from last year's crop, like your tomatoes or your peppers or your onions, garlic, so on and so forth, if you're actually saving and harvesting seeds from year over year, you can naturally get away with just paying for the first time and then maybe buying some new soils. So it's a great cost saver to actually start with seeds because your transplant plants, we'll get into a little bit later, have a little bit higher cost to those. So you can get away with almost pennies per crop, if you will, when you break it down that way. Another great thing for starting seeds indoors is you get to choose your own soil. And what I mean by that is that you don't want to just go out into the garden and dig up some soil and plant it in your plants to get your seeds started. Most of the time they don't have the right nutrients. They're too compact, they're not loose enough, not well draining enough. So you get to actually go out and choose which soil is best for those seed starts. So in that you can get some nice well-draining potting mix, you can get some seed start mix, you can make your own for very cheap if you do your own mix with some peat moss, some topsoil, some compost. Those are great methods to really get some seeds started and get a good jump start there. You can order seeds as a variety globally. I touched on this a little bit, but most people don't really realize the impact of that. Is you don't just have to go to your local grocery store or supermarket or home goods store and buy your seeds. You can actually, there are plenty of great sites that actually sell seeds, and you can get them shipped to you, and you can get varieties from across the globe. Now, I would recommend, right now it is the beginning of February 1st for me. That's when I would make sure that you are getting your seeds, because there's already people actually quoting that they're starting to become a seeds shortage. And then two, I think most of you are aware that we've got some issues with delayed shipping, especially if you're shipping internationally. So that, not to put a scare or a panic out there for you guys, but just something to be aware. I would get a jump start on getting your seeds, so you make sure you don't fall behind on getting your seeds started 4 to 6 weeks out. Depending on your zone, maybe you should have already had your seeds. Rewarding. And what I mean by this is that it is absolutely rewarding to see a seed sprout and get a plant for the first time. If you've never had grown something from a seed, it is absolutely miraculous to see that life cycle to actually sprout. There's nothing more rewarding, and I think every gardener would say this, than actually seeing your crops come in for the very first time. So that's a huge benefit to indoor seed starting. Another thing for starting indoors is protecting from pests when the seedlings are small. There are a lot of animals out there, possums being one of them, or opossums, depending on where you're at in the globe, what you might call it. It means the same thing. But there are lots of deer, things like that in my area. They like to eat seedlings. Now, once they get past a certain point, they no longer actually eat the seedlings, but when they're small, there's a lot of animals and critters that love seedlings. So that's a huge pro to starting indoors versus direct sowing. Is not every seedling is necessary to start indoors, but your flowers, things like that, that's a good reason to potentially, if these are your prize winning, you're really excited about these flowers and you don't want to lose them to some pests, that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing about it is it saves garden space. So when you direct sow, you actually just might throw a trail of seeds out there, and they're all popping up. And when you actually sow inside, you actually you're going to transplant and actually space them and put them where you want. The other side of that is that when I direct sow something in the ground, I've now reserved that spot. I'm waiting for that crop to come in. And let's say it takes 6, 8, 9 weeks or it never comes in. So I've dedicated this space to something coming in that may not come up. So in the meantime, if I've grown them indoors, I can now transplant them there and put them there. I'm not reserving that space for something else. And that's what I mean by it's safe space in your garden. It's not dedicated already to something else. So let's get into the cons now. Those are just some pros with indoor seed planting. Let's get into the actual cons that might come along with doing indoor seed planting. As we mentioned, buying soil is a huge part, or getting your own soil type is a huge part in growing seeds indoors. But remember, with that comes the cost of actually buying soil. A bag of Miracle-Gro potting mix, for example, is not a bad way to start. It comes fertilizer, it's got nutrients to get your things started. It's a loose draining soil. A lot of people go that route, but last time I bought a small bag of Miracle-Gro, I was looking upwards of $10 to $15 just for that. And luckily I found a larger one at Sam's Club for the same price, but you may not have that in your area and they sell out fast. So buying, and especially if you want to look at organic soils per se, and you want to look for those very specific kinds of soils, your price just grows and grows. So remember, when you're planning for indoor seed starts, the cost of soil goes up. Mixing your own soil is absolutely the best way to stretch your dollar. It may cost a lot to get those individual bags, but then mixing it together is going to stretch it a lot further. Something to keep in mind. Another con is, unless you have a southwest facing window, and even if you do, it may be too filtered light and it may not work. You may have to invest in grow lights. Grow lights can be a very expensive way to start plants, and you may just not have the space to set up grow lights. And that's one of the other cons, is you may just not have the space to set up plants or seedling starts inside your house. I don't have a southwest facing window. So what I have to do is I have these metal racks that I have to set up, and then I have to tie grow lights to them, and it's a bit of a pain. And this year I'm actually concerned I might not even have that space, because we just put a treadmill where I was planning on putting my actual plants and my grow lights. So, you know, it's something to keep in mind, guys, is that you may need grow lights. Grow lights are very, very expensive. There are cheaper options for it, but grow lights can definitely be expensive. I would look at secondhand, maybe on Marketplace or something like that if you're looking to. There's a lot of people that are reselling, but something to keep in mind. Plants can actually grow off of just regular light bulbs like you see above you. It's just about how far away from they are the plant and how strong those are. So something to bear in mind, but it can get costly to set up, and the electricity that you're running that, because you need 8 to 12 hours a day minimum, so cost goes up, guys. So it's something to keep in mind. Space, as I mentioned, it is hard to manage watering with that. So I will tell you, there are things you can put like pot catchers and things like that underneath them. But I was watering my plants last year, and I'd noticed a puddle would fall on the floor because I had a hole in one of them and it was draining and dripping down onto the floor. So I spent a lot of time cleaning up water after the fact because it drains out. That's one. But number two is that it is very hard to manage whether or not that happens. Sometimes your seedlings, especially if you're doing like Jiffy Pod, which I'll link that video as well, your seedlings over here might be peppers, and they've sucked up all the nutrients and all the water, and they've already dried out. Maybe that light's a little stronger on that side. And these ones over here, maybe your thing's imbalanced and not level, and so the water's all tilting that way. So it's dried out over here, and it's very moist over here. And so you're overwatering these ones, and they're dying, and they're turning yellow, and you don't know why. And these ones are drying out. So it's just something that's difficult. It takes a little bit of practice to manage that soil and watering. So just that is a con that I wanted to mention. Another thing is most people will drop 2 to 3 seeds in per pod or chamber or Dixie cup or styrofoam cup, whichever method or medium you're starting with. I've got a great video on little cardboard cups that's very cheap as far as that. Toilet paper rolls, I'll link that as well. That is another great way to start, but a lot of people drop 2 to 3 seeds per pod, so just so you can get a better germination rate in that. And what happens is a lot of times you'll get 2 or 3 sprouts, which is awesome, but then now you've got to go back, pick the healthiest of the 3 so that it doesn't suck the nutrients from the other, or you've got to separate and transplant, and that can be time consuming and not easy to do. And so thinning them out is required of that. The other thing is, another con, if you're not practiced at it, you do have to harden your plants off before you take them outside. What that means is that when the weather does start to get a little bit warmer, it doesn't have to be hot out, it doesn't have to be ready to transplant, but when it gets a little bit warmer, you have to start putting your plants out for an hour. And then you gradually, a couple days later, go 2 hours, then 3 hours. And it's a good 2-week process to get your plants out to being used to being outside for a good 8 to 10 hours before they're ready to actually then possibly be transplanted. So if you don't have a greenhouse to put them in for the day, or you don't have some shade area that you can put them under to kind of give them that, get them out in the fresh air and the wind, but not in the direct sunlight. These are things that you have to think about investing in when it comes time to harden off. And we'll do a video later on how to properly harden off your plants. Cons. Mold and diseases are actually a huge thing that happens indoors. If you don't have the right airflow or circulations, a lot of people leave the domes on when they use those pods and they start them up. Once your seedlings sprout from there, you're supposed to take the dome off, or at least vent it, let some air get in there, because a lot of times what happens, you'll start to see a fungus or a mold and grow in there, and what that means is you're not getting enough air circulation going across your plants. You may have a really dry house like I do, so now you've not got to invest in another thing, a fan, to get a nice breeze blowing across your plants, get some of that airflow and keep the mold and the disease off your plants. When now we're talking electricity, and again, back into cost. Root crops. Root crops, as I mentioned in my previous video, they don't really like to be transplanted. You're talking about your radishes, your carrots, even your potatoes, your beets. These are things that don't do well with transplanting. Trust me, I've tried and failed. I've tried and succeeded, but not well. They like to be direct sown. They don't want to be transplanted. They want to be grown in the place they're going to remain. So those are things that, some cons, that if you're planning to plant those plants, they don't work well in that environment. So there you have it, guys. That is my pros and cons list. I'm sure you guys can think of a ton of other pros and cons. Go ahead and comment on those down below. I'd love to hear them for you. But let's move on. Okay, guys, so now I want to talk about direct sowing. So for those of you who may not know what I mean by direct sowing, it means specifically putting your seeds in ground in the garden where they're going to grow. So you're not transplanting them. This is where they're going to grow and remain for the life cycle or this growing season. So without further ado, let's get into some pros of this. One great pro, as we just talked about with the cons in the previous area, is that you don't have to harden your plants off. They are weather resistant, they're hardy, they're good to go. They're growing in the place where they're going to be, so they don't need to be hardened off. They're already used to and adjusted to the weather. There's no need to transplant them. Transplant shock, if you've never heard of it, is a thing. Plants do not like to be transplanted. Every time you transplant a plant, it has to readjust to its environment. Think about it as in you're moving to a new home. You have to readjust to your area surroundings, get used to it, set down roots, if you will. So when you transplant a plant, let's talk about when you grow a seedling indoors and it's still not ready, you grew it too early, it's not ready to be put out in this outside yet. Now you're transplanting it to a larger pot. It's readjusting, reacclimating, trying to make sure that this soil feels comfortable for it. Its roots are trying to regain in the feeler, so on and so forth. Then now you're taking it outside, you've hardened it off, okay, it's going through that shock, and then now you're putting it in the ground and it's going through another transplant shock. So a lot of times plants that are started direct sown outdoors actually will grow and mature faster than ones that you've had for 6 weeks growing inside. And the reason for that is that transplant shock is it's just taking time for that plant to readjust and catch back up. It's putting all of its energy into the roots instead of into the growth. And that's what it means why it's no need to transplant with direct sowing is a great benefit. There's no adjustment period to establish, exactly what we just talked about, meaning it doesn't have to reestablish, redirect its roots. You can still order a large variety of seeds. So just like we talked about with indoor planting, you can still go online, order your seeds. They can be direct sown outdoors. Obviously, read the back of the seed package for maturity dates. Make sure that you have enough time to grow in this season. Myself personally, I can't direct sow watermelons, pumpkins are difficult, things like that, because I just don't have a long enough growing season for that fruit to mature. It's a bummer. I've tried it 2 years in a row now. It has not worked out for me. And so maybe I'll start watermelons this month. I doubt it, but it's just something that I struggle with in my zone, unfortunately. And Michigan's a terrible place to grow watermelons. For those of you who have been able to, awesome, props to you. It is less expensive to direct sow. And the reason I say that is no grow lights, no cost of electricity, none of that you were dealing with before with the indoors, no soil purchasing, all that cost is off the table. It's pennies on the dime for the seeds, or you save seeds from the previous year. So these are great things for direct sowing, right? These are great pros. It's less weeding when you direct sow. So think about it. When you direct sow, you're direct sowing in a huge line. Usually I'm going to just sprinkle 10 seeds direct sown right in a line, or maybe you're planting every other, but you're spacing 2 or 3 together. So those plants are growing up all in a row. And before you thin them out, they've zapped all the nutrients in that area and they're kind of blocking it so the weeds can't come in there. So it's a little bit less weeding time as opposed to you got to go out there and weed your garden before you can plant all these transplants from indoors, or your transplants that you're buying at the store, so on and so forth. So there can be less weeding involved in direct sowing. Let's get into some cons here when it comes to direct sowing. Germination rates are just not as good, and that's a lot of reasons why people start indoors. Most people have a really hard time germinating seeds outdoors. So in the cold areas, cold states, growing peppers outdoors is darn near impossible. It's not impossible, but it's really difficult because peppers love heat. The seeds love heat. Most people, even growing indoors, actually have to put a heat mat under them to germinate them because they just love that heat. And our ground doesn't warm up well enough until the late June, July area to really get a seed going. And by then, now it's getting too dry and not getting enough moisture. So it's kind of not a great way to get started. So there are seeds that just don't have a great germination rate. So a lot of people tend to overseed when you're direct sowing just to try to make sure your germination rate is a little bit better. And by that, I mean, for those of you who don't know the word germination, I apologize. It just means to get it sprouted, get it started. So soil temp is a large factor. And so because your ground might be colder, might be harder, it might not be able to get those seeds germinated and get them growing as fast. Seeds have a harder time taking on water when the ground is cold. When those roots are cold, they don't take on water. They kind of freeze up, lock up, so they're not taking in water and getting started as well. So definitely direct sowing can be an issue with soil temps and so on and so forth. Weather doesn't ever want to seem to cooperate here in my zone. I'm sure it's the same for a lot of you. I know the Midwest to the east is really getting hit with some nasty snowstorms right now, and it's expected to potentially loom into April for a lot of us, but we'll see, right? I've said before, Mother Nature is very fickle. And weather can be great. You might direct sow, in mid-March, and you get some great germination rates, and your seeds start to grow, and you're getting some really nice, great crops growing really tall for you already. They're strong, and then boom, a frost comes and just wipes out everything. And a lot of them, you might have 50%, 25% recover, but you've just lost a ton of your crops. So weather is a huge factor. Torrential rainstorms in the south, hurricanes, things like that you might have these can happen with any situation, but you might have just started direct sow. Spring season happens with a lot of tornadoes, things like that. So it's just weather is just in general can be a con for direct sowing. You do still have to thin out plants with direct sowing. So that is definitely a con as well. You do need to thin your plants. You might plant your 2 or 3 in there, like I said. And if you're anything like me, I hate thinning plants. And the reason I just feel so bad. It's not that it's a chore, because it's no different than weeding. It's actually easier than weeding. But I feel so bad that seed came to life and I really want that to grow. And I know it's best for the other crop next to it. And you want to pick the strongest one. But thinning out is one of the banes of my existence. It's just, I feel so bad. I want to transplant it to another spot, and that's not always a good thing, or you may not always have the room. The other thing is garden beds might not be prepped. So what I mean by this is when you plant seeds indoors, or you're planning on buying transplants, you've now got that extra 4, 6, 8 weeks that you were taking while they were growing inside. Now you've got time to go work on your garden, get your beds prepped, get your compost in there, clean them out, weed them out, and that's a great thing to do. Whereas if you're direct sowing, now you feel like you may be rushing to get all that done because it's now time to direct sow. Maybe you didn't spend the time ahead of time doing all that. So that's just another con when it comes to direct sowing. So, all right. So those are my pros and cons, guys, for the direct sowing specifically. And we went through the indoor seed starting as well. So let's get into that last one here. All right, so make sure you guys are leaving your comments below on your pros and cons for direct seed sowing, as well as any other of these 3 methods that's your favorite and why. Just give us some comments and tell us what you like. So I want to get into the last one here, which is pre-grown transplants. And what I mean by those are those plants that you go and you walk into your hardware store, like locally here in the States, Home Depot or Lowe's, your garden nurseries, because I definitely believe in supporting them, that have those starts ready to go. Those plants that are just growing, they may be a couple inches tall, they may be already bearing fruit. These are fantastic ways to go for if you're looking to just, it's late in the season, you want to get them in the ground, you want to get something going. So these are a great way to get going. So let's get into the pros and cons of those as well, guys, and we'll let you decide which method is best for you. So some pros. Many of those plants are actually locally grown. So whether that be a greenhouse or a nursery local to you, I've got a fantastic one by me that we like to use. Or you're buying from the Home Depot, Lowe's, hardware store, local grocery store, something like that, Tractor Supply. These particular plants are usually locally sourced, which means they were grown from seeds indoors, maybe that greenhouse there, or they were brought in from a local nursery just so they could resell them to you, GQ public. The reason that is awesome is because they're probably temperament for your zone. And that means that they've been grown in your area, your climate, so the seeds have kind of developed and matured to be a positive for your area. So those plants should transplant well. The other pro is, again, like I mentioned, they can be found a lot of times locally. So they're easy to find in those hardware stores, the grocery stores. You can just about find them anywhere. And local nurseries, so on and so forth. So they're great. They're convenient, if you will. Another pro is there's no need to thin, right? You don't have to thin out the plants. You may actually, it's pretty awesome. Sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 in a pot, and you always want to go for those ones if you can, because you get 3 for the price of 1, right? Why not? You can break them apart. I've got a great video on that you can check out on my own thinning. But so you can get, you don't have to thin out your pot, your pre-starts like you did before. So you can just choose, I've got this 4x4 plot of garden and I want 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, foot, and I've got 4 different pots that I bought. So no thinning involved, awesome, in ground, ready to go. There a lot of times, like I mentioned, they're already producing fruit. So you've already, wow, I'm already on my way. I didn't have to deal with the whole process, no grow lights, no worrying about the overwatering. They're already producing fruit. I'm gonna get this in the ground and let it acclimate, and within a week to 2 weeks, I'll get some new fruit off these. The other thing is, most often those things are grown by experts, especially if you support your local nurseries and greenhouses. Those are grown by experts that know what they're doing. And a lot of times you can get some great advice from them. But those plants have gotten the right start. They've gotten the right fertilizers, the right nutrients. They've done all the legwork, if you will, for you. So that's a great pro to transplants in particular. The experts have already gone and given them the nutrients, that first start in life that they need. And now it's just up to you to get them home and give them the rest of that life, if you will. So those are my pros for the transplants. I'm sure there's lots of others I haven't covered, guys, and I apologize. So let's get into the cons when it comes to buying transplants. So transplants don't always take. I know, sad but true. I've had it happen to me before. Bought it late. I thought I could bring it back, but the point is, nobody's perfect. No plant's perfect. I have bought transplants that literally I brought it home, I plopped it in the ground, gave it water, made sure it was in the right sun. I did the research on the plant, put it where it went. And the problem is that plant couldn't acclimate. Maybe it didn't get hardened off properly. Maybe if it just, didn't have the right fertilizers, it just wasn't going to make it. It was in the pot too long. It got root bound. That's an issue, absolutely. But it just didn't take for whatever reason. And so I spent that money buying that plant, and now I'm out that money because unfortunately in most places you can't just take it back and return it, right? The other thing is you don't know what fertilizers they used. I mean, you might be buying it from a local greenhouse and they might be the best people in the world and they might be willing to tell you. Or you just might be buying it from a Tractor Supply and they, they've got a kid working there who's fantastic at his job, but he's making 12 bucks an hour and he knows nothing about the plant section. And he's just like, I don't know what they use in that. It's just that we just got them in on the truck last week. So you don't know what fertilizers were used, whether they were organic, whether they're fish emulsion, whether, they had pesticides in them. You just don't know. So that's a con for me, in other words. But you don't know what seeds were used. So you'll see a lot now. There's this non-GMO in the back of packets. There's organic. There's, was that seed grown with hormones? So you don't know what seeds were used to grow that plant. You didn't grow it yourself. You didn't read the package. You don't know what seed was grown to grow that plant. You don't know if it was taken from a strain of plants that just was unnaturally grown, for example, right? A lot of times, another con here is a lot of times with transplants, you still actually have to harden them off. Well, keep this in mind, guys. The greenhouse or local nursery that you were just in might not have their windows open yet because it's still too cold out. You might be going in there and there's this gorgeous plant selection. You're like, I want that one, I want this one, I want that one, I want that one. And you take them home, you throw them outside. It's another reason they don't transplant well, because you forgot to harden them off. So that is still a necessity a lot of times where they still need to get acclimated. Most greenhouses and hardware stores and so on and so forth, they're not going to tell you that. They assume that you're going in there, you're buying all these plants. They're not going to say, oh yeah, don't forget to harden them off, and then give you the full 20-minute speech on what that means. Sorry about that, guys. My robot started right in the middle of the video. So we left off on hardening off. Yes, you still have to harden those transplant plants a lot of times. So if you bought it from a local hardware store and you were outside in the sunshine and it was sitting there on a rack of plants, which happens a lot, the likelihood is you don't have to harden that off. But it's just something to keep in mind. If you get the chance, you can ask your local place that you purchased it from whether they've been outside, how long have they been outside, so you have a jump start on that. But keep that in mind. So the next con is it actually costs anywhere from $3 to $20 to purchase a plant. It can be very expensive to purchase those plants. Imagine that you are looking to get a source of some heirloom tomatoes, for example, and some early girls, and then you want some jalapeno peppers, you want some green bell peppers, and they're all $5 each, just on average. You're looking to get 2 of each variety. Now we're up to 8 different plants at $5 a piece, and very quickly, now we're up to $40, and we haven't even checked out, and that's just a small portion of a garden. We haven't even gotten into our herbs maybe we want to grow. We haven't gotten into our lettuces, our greens. So transplants can get very expensive, very costly, very quickly. And another con is you're not going to really often find your root crops. As I mentioned before in the indoors, that root crops don't like to transplant. Most times you're not going to find a pre-start for a carrot, for example. You're not going to find a pre-start or a transplant plant available for a radish. You might, and it is mainly because you can eat the tops of beets and radishes, so they're growing them for the lettuces or the greens. They're not necessarily growing them for the beets itself, but they may have started it with a larger pot or a plug, and they're expecting you to take that whole soil, dig that out, and put that in there, so you're not really disturbing the roots and that. But it's going to be rare, and it's not usually what you're going to find. Another con is that you don't have the same variety you have with buying seeds. As we mentioned before, you can source seeds globally. You can find rare fruits from across the globe and try to grow them just to try your luck. You can find an avocado tree or avocado pit and bring that in, so on and so forth, but you're not going to find those usually at your local nursery. You may find an awesome nursery or greenhouse that specializes in that kind of stuff, and that's cool, but even then they're not going to have every variety that might be out there on the internet. So it's just something to keep in mind, guys. That's my last con. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing, hit that notification bell, give this video a like if you liked it, share it out with some friends. And as always, guys, I hope you guys are staying safe and enjoying your gardens.